The media remain heavily focused on President Trump's shot at the so-called judge and his ridiculous ruling blocking the temporary ban on refugees and citizens of 7 countries, which a federal appellate panel has now upheld unanimously. What really sent the story into the stratosphere was Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal reporting on his private meeting with Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch.
He certainly expressed to me that he is disheartened by the demoralizing and abhorrent comments made by President Trump about the judiciary.
The president responded by attacking Blumenthal and the coverage, first on Twitter and then with reporters.
You misrepresented his comments totally.
I asked you what your thoughts were, sir.
His comments is ask Senator Blumenthal about his Vietnam record that didn't exist after years of saying it did.
The media war continues. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Aaron McPike, White House correspondent for Independent Journal Review. Meghan McCain, the co-host of Outnumbered on FNC. And Joe Trippi, Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor. Aaron, so the press reports that Neil Gorsuch told several senators he's disheartened and disillusioned about attacks on the judiciary. Trump says the media are mischaracterizing, misinterpreted his remarks. What's going on here?
Well, what I found so interesting was that a day after those remarks came out, suddenly everybody said, well, maybe this actually helps Gorsuch because it shows that he's independent of Trump and he can appeal to some Democrats. But it took a day for that to come through. Now, that could have been really good spin for the White House. I don't know why they didn't get on board with that earlier.
That was my initial reaction. But, Meghan, are the media making too much of Richard Blumenthal's account of his private meeting with Gorsuch? And especially since the senator says that Gorsuch gave him permission to sort of go public with it.
It wasn't just Richard Blumenthal. Senator Ben Sasse came out and echoed the sentiments that he said. I mean, I agree with Aaron that I wasn't sure if this was just a political spin trying to make Neil Gorsuch look like more of a person Democrats can confirm. You know, this entire thing has turned into one reality television show segment, one tweet away. We're all waiting to see how Donald Trump reacts, bringing up Richard Blumenthal's, record of lying about being in Vietnam. And I think...
I take it you're not being complimentary when you say it resembles reality TV.
How do you keep up this momentum? How do you keep up the momentum of every single minor criticism, which, as Guy Benson reported earlier, was a minor criticism? How do you have such an intense reaction on Twitter and keep this up for the next 4 years? I absolutely have no idea.
We'll examine that for the next 4 years. Now, Joe, so Trump attacked Senator Blumenthal for lying about having served in Vietnam as opposed to in the Marine Reserves. This was a half dozen years ago in a campaign, and that's true. But Blumenthal's account was confirmed to the press by a Gorsuch spokesman.
Spokesman, and also you had people, as Meghan said, Republicans saying said similar things to them. And also, I mean, so now what are we supposed to do? Now we go back and we didn't. We're going to go back to Vietnam, and was the president? What was his record in Vietnam? I mean, that started to fly back and forth too.
So do you think, bottom line, that this is overplayed or played about right or underplayed by the press?
Well, the problem is the president comes out and says this stuff.
Therefore, it is news.
Or it's news, and they're going to follow.
Can I jump in on that for a second? During the press briefing, while this was addressed, there were a number of questions for 6 minutes over what demoralizing meant and how the White House was responding. There was one question in that briefing about earlier in the day, the U.S. commander in Afghanistan asked for thousands more troops to be deployed. Got one question, and then it wasn't really even answered. So both sides aren't really giving the right amount of coverage to
well, on the
really
one hand,
important.
it is a Supreme Court nomination at stake here.
Sure.
On the other hand, all kinds of other things get overshadowed. Yeah, that's true. So one of those who interviewed Blumenthal when this erupted was Chris Cuomo on a CNN morning show. And that prompted this tweet from the President of the United States. Chris Cuomo, in his interview with Senator Blumenthal, never asked him about his long-term lie about his brave, quote, service in Vietnam. Fake news. Well, Cuomo then reacted in real time, first by playing a portion of his earlier interview with Blumenthal, and then by saying this.
What is your response to the President of the United States saying you should not be believed because you misrepresented your military record in the past? Literally, the first point that I made in the interview. The President, with all due respect, is once again off on the facts.
What do you make of the way that Cuomo went back at the President?
Well, he was right to say he did bring this up, okay? I think in general...
He brought it up and the Senator ducked it for the record. He didn't really answer the question.
Yeah, that's right. But look, when there's a war, there's a way for CNN to get ratings. And right now, the war is CNN versus Trump. I think other networks and other news organizations are finding ways to say, what he said was not accurate, or the number is this, not that. And CNN is really taking this on in a way that inserts them into the story.
Cuomo, by the way, also apologized for a later interview in which he said, for a journalist, being called fake news, it's like being called the N-word. That was not a good choice of words, and I'm glad that he apologize for it. Do you want to jump in on this CNN debate? Because there's a constant battle now between the White House and that network.
I was actually going to bring up the fact that Chris Cuomo said that the term fake news is like using the N-word. I don't know exactly what he's doing, but that's obviously an egregious statement to make. When you are being parodied on Saturday Night Live, as CNN is, as being a baby in a cage at a press conference with Sean Spicer, clearly there's an optic problem between CNN and the president. It seems like they are doubling down on this rivalry and this war, which I would think is ill-advised, but it's certainly going to be fascinating to watch going forward.
That's exactly what's going on. I mean, the president keeps calling them out specifically as fake news. I mean, that they are the fake news. They're going to keep pushing back, and it just keeps escalating.
So is the president getting what he wants by putting CNN on the defensive?
What about it helps him with his base, because as long as it looks like you're going after the liberal media and these fake news journalists at CNN aren't giving you the good college try as president that you should because you're a Republican, it only helps his base. What it does for independent voters is nothing, but it really rabble-rouses the group of people that helped get him elected.
What about the larger media debate here about Trump and the judiciary and undermining judges, and of course the battle over this appellate ruling, which is not clear what the White House is going to do about that? So in the Washington Post, Chris Cillizza writes, major setback for his conception of a presidency with nearly unlimited power after the Ninth Circuit ruled.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to take anything Chris Cillizza says that seriously. But that being said, I love the Neil Gorsuch pick. I think he's exactly what, supporters of Antonin Scalia would have wanted, and he's the rightful heir.
But I want you to respond to Cillizza.
Okay.
Major setback because of the Ninth Circuit ruling against. Is it a major setback? Because it's an argument about a temporary restraining order.
I don't think it's a major setback, but that being said, what we discussed earlier on the show, I think he should quit tweeting in sort of the impulsive way that he is, because all the political capital that you got by making this great choice sort of goes out the window with these tweets.
Well, that's what he said. Chris Cillizza saying this helps Trump with his base. I mean, that some establishment figures in Washington are saying that it's a big setback. Are you kidding me? He's trying to do his ban, whether you want to call it a ban or not. The courts are stopping him. He goes after the so-called judges, the elites in Washington. Yeah. Hair goes on fire. Spoken as
a true political consultant. I want to move on to this other issue involving Michael Flynn. Very controversial story now after the Washington Post quoted 9 unnamed officials, senior officials, as saying that the National Security Advisor had discussed before Trump took office the question of U.S. sanctions with the Russian ambassador, which the sources, according to this story in the Post, view as inappropriate and potentially illegal. Let me play for you how some television anchors are treating this leaked story.
If this is proven that he did this, do you think he should be disciplined in any way? Should he leave the White House?
How do you read what's happening here with Mike Flynn? Is it a large enough deal that he should be asked by the president to step aside?
This is how a media drumbeat starts, where then every segment is tagged with or has a question about, should he resign? Could he resign? Why won't he resign? Is that what journalists should be doing?
If you ask a leading question, you're going to get a defensive answer. The question should be, what is the administration doing about this? What should the repercussions be? What should standards be going forward? And then you might get a little bit more in that interview. It only harms the interviewer by asking those leading questions.
Now, Megan, this is a serious story and a serious question. But the coordinated leak here, because of so many different sources, suggests that there are people in this administration who would like perhaps to push Michael Flynn out. And of course, what they're also trying to do is hurt President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, the White House has a leak problem from the top down starting for the last 3 weeks. This particular story, if you care at all about Russia and the administration's relationship with Vladimir Putin, this is an extremely serious story. There's allegations that he took money and that he made a phone call on Christmas Day and then lied to our vice president. These are very intense allegations. But if you make this partisan and this about they should step down, this administration is behaving in the wrong way, and you make this a Democrat versus Republican issue instead of about national security, that's where the media gets it wrong.
So you think the media are making it excessively partisan? Potentially.
I think when it looks like you are... Go ahead.
I just think this is a drip, drip, drip in which Flynn himself is sort of adding to the fire by suddenly can't recall, doesn't remember. Maybe I did say
Well, just to get it straight, initially Flynn told the Washington Post that that conversation never happened. They didn't discuss it. Then the next day, he said that he doesn't recall it, as you say, Joe, but he doesn't think it came up. And, of course, Vice President Pence defended him on national television, on Fox News Sunday, in fact, and elsewhere, based on Flynn's assurances.
Right. So what I'm saying is the way they've handled it, the way Flynn's handled this in terms of walking things back, I think is just flaming more questions. And you're going to have, look, there are partisans inside the White House who want to get rid of him. There are partisans outside. They're going to take advantage of this and flame the media. And these, I think you're right, these leading questions.
You also had
just sort of putting more pressure on him.
You also had a leak to Reuters about how when President Trump was talking to Vladimir Putin and the New START treaty came up, he asked an aide, well, what is that? And the White House disputes that. But so many leaks from within the building or other buildings like the State Department.
They definitely have a leaking problem right now, which if I were working in the White House, I would be doing as much as possible to find out exactly whom it's coming from and why. All of that being said, this story is legitimate. My concern is everything having to do with Russia is spun by the White House and by President Trump as being, sort of part of the DNC conspiracy theory. And there are legitimate questions that people want answered. Absolutely
legitimate story. The way it's being covered is something that we examine here. You can let us know what you think about the media. Media Buzz at foxnews.com. Ahead, Sarah Huckabee Sanders responds on behalf of the White House. But when we come back, a major media pushback against the president's charge of inadequate coverage of terror attacks. Does he have a point? There's been a media revolt against President Trump over his charge that news organizations aren't covering many terror attacks or aren't covering them enough. And that quote, as you saw earlier, they have their reasons. Meghan McCain, the network says we saw a pushback pretty hard on this. Trump says they're not covering it for a reason. What do you make of this back and forth?
Yeah, I didn't understand this at all. And you need more evidence than just simply sending out a list of terror attacks that, in my opinion, were covered very well, especially extensively on this network. I also find it strange that your spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, is going on TV and making up massacres at the same time. She took
that
a
was
lot
a
of
mistake
for that.
For which she
It was
apologized.
a mistake, but it's still being used in memes and protest signs all over the country. Sorry, continue.
I think you keep cutting her off. She has to cut you
cutting
off.
me off.
I think many journalists. I'm going to cut you off now. I think many journalists are personally offended by this. I'm going to give you a lot of time, Joe, because they've gotten on planes to cover the aftermath of some of these.
Well, yeah, but that offense is worked for Trump again. I watched the news that day. They pushed back so hard. Let us show you all the times we covered.
And how does that help him?
I'm sitting there at home going like, man, that's a lot of attacks. I mean, in other words, it actually kind of, he's a win-win. If they all back off and say, yeah, you're right, we didn't, he wins. And if they come back and show a lot of the coverage that they did, they're making his point.
There was a kernel of a concept that was worthy of more discussion, that maybe we don't cover foreign policy and national security enough. Now, was he wrong in what he said? Yes. Did media organizations push back as they should have? Yes, but maybe we could have discussed it a little bit further. You recall in 2014, there were tons of ISIS beheadings, and then there was a discussion after that maybe we shouldn't give ISIS that much publicity.
But that's exactly the point I was going to bring up, Megan. The debate in media circles before this has been whether we give these attacks too much coverage, whether the press is playing into the terrorists' hands by making it the lead story for days and days. It's a hard dilemma to resolve, and here's the president saying they're not covering some of these attacks adequately, and they have their reasons. What do you think he was insinuating?
Well, the implication is that there are political reasons why the Obama administration somehow wasn't letting you know about terror attacks.
Well,
but there's a thing called social media and the internet. Yes, and played it down. Again, if we're like taking reality and taking it a few steps further, I would assume that means just because the Obama administration was saying everything's going amazing in Iraq and Afghanistan, ISIS has not metastasized, it hasn't grown, and he was trying to say they were covering in that way. All of this is really clumsy narrative. I mean, you know this very well. I just wish they could keep this concise and tight instead of trying to, read the tea leaves of exactly the kernel of truth, as you said, they're trying to say.
But I agree with Aaron. There was a missed opportunity to actually have a discussion about how we cover this, and instead it was just sort of defensive and going right back on the attack against something the president
The White House
said.
list of 78 attacks included some that there were no casualties and some that we hadn't heard of because they were, look, we obviously cover attacks far more intensively when they're on foreign soil and they're not in a place like Britain or France. But they also included Orlando, San Bernardino, Paris, Nice, which got saturation coverage.
Oh, there are a lot of people who would argue, and I'd be one of them, that on some of them we just covered them so much and put so much fear out there. And that's the argument, I think, that when we...
Just if I can inject one last note here in the time we have left. So President Trump also this week talked about how the murder rate in our country is the highest it's been in 47 years. Actually, it's near a half-century low. The next day he used a different statistic about the increase, which was accurate. So there seems to be a constant, and we talked about this a little bit with CNN, well, the president was wrong about this, the president was wrong about that. CBS's Scott Pelley says, divorced from reality in the lead of his newscast.
Look, they do need to get their facts straight. And President Trump should make that a goal of his for the year 2017 to start putting out accurate statistics. I do think back on the terrorism thing, though, I would like to ask him, what is it that you think the American public is missing? Not just what is the media not covering. What do you want to tell us about terrorism that you've learned since taking office?
Well, you're at the White House every day now. You can ask that question. Aaron McPack, we'll see you later. Meghan McCain, Joe Trippi, thanks for stopping by this Sunday. Ahead, how the media are treating Elizabeth Warren as opposed to, say, Sean Spicer. But up next, a media furor over the president whacking Nordstrom for dropping his daughter's clothing line. Trish Regan is on deck. When Nordstrom announced it was dropping Ivanka Trump's clothing line, the company touched off a major controversy and a presidential response on Twitter. Quote, my daughter Ivanka has been treated so unfairly by @Nordstrom. She's a great person, always pushing me to do the right thing. Terrible. And then there's another one in which the president says Ivanka is being abused and treated so badly by the media. I spoke about the coverage with Trish Regan, who hosts the Intel Report on Fox Business weekdays at 2 Eastern. Trish Regan, welcome.
Hi, Howie.
So Nordstrom says Ivanka Trump's clothing line just isn't selling that well, so we decided to drop it 2 weeks into the administration. Are you buying that?
Not entirely, no. I think that there's a lot of politics at play here, and we're seeing it over and over again, increasingly so in businesses, and it's a little disturbing, Howie. I think what really was going on here is that Nordstrom's didn't like getting the shock effect of all the people that don't like Trump going after them on Twitter, and so this is their response. This is how they're dealing with it.
Right. So let me ask you, the president, as everyone now knows, decides to put up a tweet criticizing Nordstrom's decision on the grounds, and the press just really pounces on this on the grounds that he's trying to help his daughter's business. Your take?
I think, let's not forget, this man is a father, and his daughter's been slighted, and you've got daughters, I've got daughters. I mean, as a parent, part of what you would always do is stick up for your child. So I think that there's a whole lot more at play here, and this is in part just a dad being a dad.
Right, but the argument is it's not just a dad being a dad because he's the president of the United States and he is targeting a specific corporation. That's the argument, at least, that I see in a lot of the stories.
Yeah, and people have gone after him for targeting a lot of different corporations. For for example, going after the F-35 program, saying we need to change this and we need to. He has done that, and he's got certainly a bully pulpit, if you would, that makes it a little nerve-wracking for businesses. And I guess Nordstrom now is seeing his wrath. And I hear you. There's some criticism that perhaps he shouldn't have done this, but I think this may have been just somewhat of an emotional response. And when someone goes after your child, Howie, you go back at them, even if you're the president of the United States.
I can understand that part. Now, Kellyanne Conway, as you know, got in a bit of hot water when she went on Fox and Friends and said this.
Go buy Ivanka's stuff is what I would tell you. I'm gonna get. I hate shopping. I'm gonna go get some on myself today. I'm gonna give a free commercial here. Go buy it today, everybody. You can find it online.
Sean Spicer later said that Kellyanne Conway had been counseled. Did she make a mistake?
I think that Kellyanne, if she could, would take back those comments. I think that she perhaps spoke too hastily there, and she absolutely would take back those comments. But all these concerns about ethics right now, I mean, the one thing I'd tell you, Howie, is at least it's all out in the open, right? At least we all know about it. With Donald Trump, what you see is what you get, and you know that this stuff is going on. So I think the real danger, perhaps, Howie, in Washington, happens to be those backroom deals that you don't hear about. That's what we need to be concerned about.
But on this point,
she probably would take it back, but it's not like it's going to make or break anything.
Right. On this point about all the concerns about ethics, is there a media mindset that the main thing that Donald Trump wants to do is somehow, beyond sort of running the world, is to enrich himself and enrich his family by doing things that will help the family business?
There absolutely is that mindset. Here's the reality, Howie. He's the president of the United States. Anybody who is president of the United States will, just by being the president, enrich themselves. In other words, the value of all of his holdings, all of his real estate, I'm sorry, he's president. It just went up. And that's the reality, and the media just needs to get over it.
He's already got a fair amount of money. Trish Regan, great to see you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Good to see you, Howie. You bet.
Ahead on Media Buzz is the press lionizing Elizabeth Warren after Senate Republicans shut her down on the floor. But first, Sarah Huckabee Sanders is here with the White House view of all these negative stories swirling around the president. Time now to get the White House view of this flood of negative stories. And joining us here in the studio, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Deputy Communications Director for President Trump. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you.
Just a few days you've had stories on President Trump losing the court case in the Ninth Circuit. You have had stories about, unflattering stories about the president's call with Vladimir Putin, President Trump and Kellyanne Conway defending Ivanka on the Nordstrom matter. It's not that these aren't legitimate stories, but do you feel at all that you can't even buy a positive headline?
Look, I think some of the stories may have a little bit of legitimacy, but as a whole, I really don't think they do. But I think what it tells you is that the more that President Trump's opponents go negative, he's probably doing something right. He's had probably 21 of the most successful days that any first-term president has had. Look at all he has accomplished. Look how aggressive he has been. He campaigned on change and turning Washington upside down, and nobody can argue that the first 21 days have not been exactly what he promised on the campaign trail.
Well, I'm sure you're not arguing that the court battle over the temporary travel ban is not a legitimate story. But let me move on to this. We have major media organizations pushing back, we played this earlier, against the president for saying that the press as a whole is either downplaying or not adequately covering many terror attacks. And he went on to say they have their reasons. What did he mean?
Look, I think the big point here is look at the number of attacks that we've had. I think he's just trying to demonstrate the seriousness of what is taking place in our country and around the world right now, and that we cannot allow people to come into our country. And he's trying to prove a point of why this travel executive order is so important. He's looking out for the safety of our country.
Sarah, when he says, what did they mean? He appears to be insinuating that there's some sort of political agenda reason that the press, in his view, isn't giving enough coverage to many terror attacks. Is that the president's meaning?
Look, again, I go back. The meaning is real clear, and it's real simple. Any terrorist attack, even one, is too many. And we have to do everything that we can to ensure that that doesn't happen again.
Does that include a lot of coverage? Does that help make the case?
Well, I think making those things known. Look, here's a problem. When we're covering the death of Prince more than we're covering terrorist attacks, that's a problem. That is a big discrepancy, and I think that that was the point he was trying to make. Again, it's not that we need to do wall-to-wall coverage, but we need to do wall-to-wall protection, and that's what this president is trying to do. He's trying to do everything he can to protect our borders, protect our country, and fulfill the #1 job of the president, which is keeping Americans safe.
All right, so White House official Stephen Miller was on all the Sunday shows today except for CNN's State of the Union, and one White House official who did, same thing with Pence last week, by the way, with Vice President Pence. One official who did go on Jake Tapper's weekday show is Kellyanne Conway. Let's take a look at that.
It's very difficult to hear those criticisms from a White House that has such little regard day in, day out for facts, for truth. Are we fake news, Kellyanne? Is CNN fake news?
No, I don't think CNN is fake news. I think there are some reports everywhere, in print, on TV, on radio, in conversation, that are not well researched and are sometimes based on falsehoods.
So is the White House essentially boycotting CNN, at least on Sunday mornings, by not making top officials available?
Not at all. And I'd like to clear up, there was an offer for someone to go on last week, and they didn't take us up on it.
Well, this week, Jake Tapper says the White House just simply didn't get back to him.
Well, I'm not sure about what happened this week. I'm happy to go on Jake's show anytime. But I think that the bigger question is, when are they going to start to show, particularly Jake, I watched that interview, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way to say it, but he just wasn't, it wasn't journalism. And until they want to start asking real questions and talking about real stories that Americans care about, instead of getting in the back and forth and the...
I have to jump in here. Why wasn't it journalism? That's a pretty serious charge.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying the entire interview, but there were parts of it, like the accusations of boycotting their network and things like that, when we've clearly offered for people to be on. I think that's a big deal, and that's a serious charge for them.
Let's talk about your colleague Sean Spicer for a second. There's been a lot of media chatter about his job, not just because Melissa McCarthy played him again last night on SNL, but the Washingtonian magazine reported that the former Navy SEAL Carl Higbie, quote, according to the article, has been interviewed for the position of White House press secretary, according to 2 senior administration officials. And I'm just bringing this up to give you a chance to respond, because I understand you were involved in that.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the most ridiculous stories out there right now. And frankly, one of the reasons that I find this story to be so absurd is because one of the closing lines of the story was that they reached out to the White House for comment and we didn't respond, when I was the one that actually talked to that reporter an hour before her story posted and told her how untrue every part of that story was. Carl Higbie's never even been to the White House, much less interviewed for a position. And the fact that she went ahead and published the story and also failed to mention that she had talked to me is mind-boggling. And I think a perfect example of why we are so frustrated with the amount of fake news out there, and that reporters are not letting the facts get in the way of those fake news stories.
Well, Higbie later backed off and said he hadn't had any formal interviews in his phrase, but all of these leaks, this particular leak story, which is essentially about White House infighting, and the Washington Post story about Michael Flynn, serious subject, conversations he had with the Russian ambassador before the inauguration, and about the president's conversations with world leaders, unflattering versions put out. How concerned is the president about this flood of leaks, all of which, or many of which, I would say, seem aimed at undermining him?
Look, I think the number one concern the president has right now is creating jobs, protecting Americans, building a wall, making education better. He's focused on doing exactly what he spent the last year and a half talking about, not talking about the stories that the media wants to play up, because when he's traveling around the country, when we're talking to people around the country, that's not the thing they care about. That's not what's keeping them up at night. That's not the focus of this White House.
You see the leaks as trying to get the president off his game rather than talking about the issues that he thinks are important to the country to change the environment?
Absolutely. Howie, look at what we have done over the last 21 days. Why are we not talking about the number of jobs that he's created, how much the market has improved, how we have a stronger, more stable economy?
It's gotten some attention.
Very little. Compare how much attention that has gotten to how much attention the petty games and things that people don't really care about, that don't affect Americans. And that's what we're focused on, is how we can improve and make America great again.
You got the slogan in. Sarah Huckabee Sanders, thanks very much for coming in to Fox on this Sunday. We appreciate it. Coming up, did Senate Republicans turn Elizabeth Warren into a media hero? And is there too much speculative coverage, as we just talked about, of Sean Spicer, who was spoofed again last night on Saturday Night Live? Elizabeth Warren has been a hot media property this week, doing lots of interviews after a debate on the Jeff Sessions nomination, in which she was reading a letter from Martin Luther King's widow, and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell invoked a rule that forced her to sit down.
So can I continue with Coretta Scott King's letter?
Mr. President.
They are...
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Senators impugn the motives and conduct of our colleague from Alabama as warned by the chair.
Do you think what Senator McConnell did last night was sexist?
I think what he did was wrong. I think reading the words of Coretta Scott King on the floor of the United States Senate honors the Senate.
Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Gail Trotter, political commentator and a contributor to Town Hall on the Hill, and Mara Liasson, White House correspondent for NPR and a Fox News contributor. Gail, there's not much question that Mitch McConnell made this into a huge national story, but were the media rather ready to embrace Elizabeth Warren?
They were ready to embrace her, but you think about that, the controversy surrounding Senator Sessions' nomination was dying down. It was an old story, and the Republicans, in silencing Elizabeth Warren, created a martyr out of her. And when the male colleagues came and read the letter that she had been silenced about, then it really made it a news story, because then you could argue about the sexism implications of it. So they covered it, and they were right to cover it.
Suddenly, Senator Warren is doing lots of interviews with MSNBC and CNN, being asked if this is sexist, and lots of people in the media world talking about whether she's running for president in 2020.
There's no doubt that she's the heroine for the, with a O-I-N-E, yes, for the left. And what's interesting about Elizabeth Warren does go on television a lot, but she doesn't talk to reporters on the Capitol. And Glenn Thrush had a great anecdote where years ago he interviewed her and he was given 18 minutes to interview her. And at 18 minutes, mid-sentence, that's it. She cut him off and got up and walked away. So she has a TV-oriented press strategy. But I do think Mitch McConnell gave her a huge boost, especially because he let other senators read the same letter who happened to
All right, so we have consensus on that point. But was the rather warm media reception that Senator Warren got linked to the fact that she was fighting Jeff Sessions as opposed to, let's just say, Ted Cruz going up on the floor against Obamacare?
Right, I think it was because she was fighting Jeff Sessions. So it was definitely the content of what she was saying. And when McConnell came out and gave that statement about she persisted.
Nevertheless, she persisted.
Nevertheless,
it was so poetic.
Yes, it made it a rallying cry.
It was made T-shirt ready.
Right, so it was made for
That's why. It wasn't because she was talking about Jeff Sessions. Yeah. It was because he made her stop talking and he didn't make male people who said the same thing. That's
I just remember when she said she wasn't running for president repeatedly in 2016, and the media would not take no for an answer until Hillary actually got in. All right, so Sean Spicer, everyone knows, last week, Melissa McCarthy, Saturday Night Live, did the funny skit. She was back again on it last night. Let's play a little bit, and I'll ask you a question on the other side.
80% of the people in Chicago have been murdered and are dead.
You know what? I'm looking at the real numbers here, and they directly contradict everything that
I take a little poetic license there. Mara, you're in the briefing room every day. Do you think the SNL skits and all these speculative pieces about Sean Spicer 3 weeks in are unfair?
I think they are, but you know what? He has the toughest job in the administration right now. Mm-hmm. He has a boss who watches the briefing, from what we understand, almost in toto, right, and who comments on it. And I think these skits are funny. I think they only matter to Sean Spicer's tenure if the president doesn't like them.
You know,
but 43 million people are watching these briefings.
4.3 million.
I mean, 4.3 million people are watching these briefings. He's a big hit.
So it's not just SNL, but Samantha Bee and Stephen Colbert and John Oliver and Seth Meyers. I mean, the late night comedians are mocking Trump and people who work for President Trump in sometimes funny, sometimes serious ways. Does that matter?
To his job longevity? I don't think so.
Well, to Spicer's job longevity, I don't think so either.
Right,
I think it's just funny, it's late night stuff. But is it changing perceptions? I mean, we always talk about the impact of, Tina Fey doing Sarah Palin.
Yes.
So changing perceptions in a cultural way for this White House.
Well, certainly that's the effort. But if you think specifically about Melissa McCarthy's stick, her comedic stick is to be an overweening personality who is aggressively trying too hard. And I think that captures the spirit of some of the press corps, because they have this acrimonious relationship with this administration, which is usually the case. They want to be adversarial with any administration. But the fact that Melissa McCarthy, in doing that, is able to capture some of that zeitgeist, I think does represent what is going on.
Just briefly, I went to a briefing this week, and it was tense. And so I wonder if you think there is more of an edge to the questions reporters are asking in this administration.
I think there's more of an edge because this is the administration that has said the press is the opposition party.
So,
and vice versa.
And vice versa. During the campaign,
but that suggests that the press is living up to that label if they're going to be more aggressive than they were in the Obama administration.
I think the press has to be aggressive. They have to hold every administration accountable. Whether they're going over the line, we can discuss each instance and decide that. But I do think this is an adversarial relationship, and the White House wants to make it that way.
And as you say, the ratings are pretty good for those daytime briefings. Mara Lias and Gail Trotter, thanks very much for joining us. After the break, Kellyanne Conway on whether the press is practically demanding that Melania Trump take a more active role as First Lady. There have been a spate of stories about Melania Trump staying out of the spotlight as First Lady. Us Weekly even had a cover showing the first couple with the headline, "Separate Lives." This as Melania has chosen to remain in New York while their 10-year-old son Barron finishes the school year. And that subject came up in my recent interview with Kellyanne Conway.
Melania and Mrs. Trump has made a decision that I respect enormously to stay in New York with her son. I wish I could be with my children that much. Everybody's making a sacrifice
here. And lately
here.
There's been a lot of media stories, and there was a cover of Us Weekly, Separate Lives, kind of questioning Melania Trump's decision and why she isn't taking a more public role as First Lady.
It's none of their business. She has plenty of a public role. The woman is beautiful inside and out, brilliant. She speaks 5 languages. I speak 1 because I'm American. I'm monolingual. And she speaks 5 languages. She's absolutely brilliant. She was a successful entrepreneur in her own right. And she is a loving and supportive wife and mother. And I have to say, a great friend and a great role model to many of us who work closely with the president and the first family. But she doesn't, she doesn't call attention to herself. And I think people can't stand that because it's not to type. They want to see, they want to poke, they want to dissect and wonder. I so admire the fact that Melania Trump, our first lady, is so comfortable in her own skin that she doesn't have to disprove anybody's negative stories or even positive stories. She's starting to hire her staff now. She has nothing to prove to anyone. But she represents this nation. She will do it with dignity and class and elegance and eloquence and the brilliance and the entrepreneurship. And really to have an immigrant as our first lady, somebody who waited and went through the proper channels, waited, I'm told, up to 10 years to get go through the proper channels, get everything approved. It's so gratifying to me to see that in 2017, frankly, an immigrant first lady. Who's covering that story? Why isn't she out there? Because she's not singing Kumbaya with the protesters and their signs, the privileged white kids coming out of the ivory tower saying, look at my sign. They have no idea what they're protesting. They're in this culture of sameness.
Erin McPike, Kellyanne Conway says, media reports about why we don't have a more public first lady, it's none of their business. Your take.
I think the coverage of Melania not being around is symptomatic of coverage of the entire Trump administration, that the press expects this to follow along similar lines to what they've seen in the past. It's sort of a tacit comparison to Michelle Obama, and Melania Trump is not Michelle Obama. We should cover Melania Trump as Melania Trump. Now, the other thing I would say is that don't we have enough to cover with the Trump administration already? There are stories coming at us left and right. There's no room for Melania Trump anyway.
Well, stories about a first lady always sells magazines, but I happen to agree with Kellyanne on this. Like, she is choosing to be a mom right now, and I think the press should just back off. We did see her, interestingly, for the first time since the inaugural weekend, on the plane with President Trump, greeting reporters as they came in before they flew down to Mar-a-Lago. Erin McPike, great to see you again. Still to come, I'm throwing a penalty flag on a Super Bowl headline that turned out to be totally wrong. Donald Trump thought he had a great opportunity to smack the New York Times for a Friday morning print story headline, China's president, stung by Taiwan calls, set to shun Trump. The piece saying that the two leaders hadn't spoken since November. The president fired up to Twitter. The failing New York Times does major fake news China story, saying Mr. Xi has not spoken to Mr. Trump since November 14th. We spoke at length yesterday. As the Times story was going to press on Thursday night and the paper had asked for comment, Trump was speaking to China's president, but that wasn't announced until 11:04 p.m. after the paper's first edition deadline. Now, that's the only edition that made it to Washington because of a snowstorm in New York. So it wasn't fake at that particular moment. Hey, I didn't think the New England Patriots had a chance either when they were down 28-3 in the Super Bowl. Even Tom Brady couldn't pull off a comeback like that, right? But the hometown Boston Globe really seemed to lose faith with this early edition headline, a bitter end. For the Falcons, maybe, after Brady won the game in overtime. That is right up there with Dewey defeats Truman, and a lesson that sports, like politics, is kind of unpredictable. Well, that's it for this edition of Media Buzz. I'm Howard Kurtz. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll like our Facebook page. Check it out. We post a lot of original content there. You can talk back to us, email us about the media, mediabuzz@foxnews.com, mediabuzz@foxnews.com. Talk to me on Twitter @Howard Kurtz. And, if you're going to miss the show, you got something else to do on Sunday, DVR it and watch it later. And we've enjoyed having you along for the ride. It seems like there's so much Trump news now, it's hard to keep up. Back here next Sunday with the latest buzz.